"Truly," cried the geographer, "but I fear I am very indiscreet." Thus far the Duncan had acquitted herself admirably. In every way her powers for steaming or sailing had been sufficiently tested, and her captain and passengers were alike satisfied with her performance and with one another. Chapter 9. Through the Strait of Magellan. The joy on board was general when Paganel's resolution was known. Young Robert threw himself on his neck with very demonstrative delight. The worthy geographer almost fell backwards. "A rough little gentleman," said he. "I will teach him geography." As Captain Mangles had engaged to make him a sailor, Glenarvan a man of honor, the Major a boy of coolness, Lady Helena a noble and generous being, and Mary Grant a pupil grateful towards such patrons, Robert was evidently to become one day an accomplished gentleman. The Duncan soon finished shipping her coal, and then leaving these gloomy regions she gained the current from the southeast coast of Brazil, and after crossing the equator with a fine breeze from the north, she entered the southern hemisphere. The passage was effected without difficulty, and everyone had good hopes. On this voyage in search of Captain Grant, the probabilities increased every day. Their captain was one of the most confident on board, but his confidence proceeded especially from the desire that he cherished so strongly at heart, of seeing Miss Mary happy and consoled. He was particularly interested in this young girl, and this feeling he concealed so well that, except Miss Grant and himself, no one on board the Duncan had perceived it. As for the learned geographer, he was probably the happiest man in the southern hemisphere. He passed his time in studying the maps with which he covered the cabin table, and then followed daily discussions with Mr. Albinett, so that he could scarcely set the table. But Paganel had all the passengers on his side except the Major, who was very indifferent to geographical questions, especially at dinner time. Having discovered a whole cargo of odd books in the mate's chests, and among them a number of Cervantes' works, the Frenchman resolved to learn Spanish, which nobody on board knew, and which would facilitate his search on the shores of Chile. Thanks to his love for philology, he did not despair of speaking this new tongue fluently on arriving at Conception. He therefore studied assiduously, and was heard incessantly muttering heterogeneous syllables. During his leisure hours, he did not fail to give young Robert practical instruction, and taught him the history of the country they were rapidly approaching. In the meantime the Duncan was proceeding at a remarkable rate. She cut the Tropic of Capricorn, and her prow was headed toward the strait of the celebrated geographer. Now and then the low shores of Patagonia were seen, but like an almost invisible line on the horizon. They sailed along the coast for more than 10 miles, but Paganel's famous telescope gave him only a vague idea of these American shores. The vessel soon found herself at the head of the strait, and entered without hesitation. This way is generally preferred by steam vessels bound for the Pacific. Its exact length is 376 miles. Ships of the greatest tonnage can always find deep water, even near its shores, an excellent bottom and many springs of water. The rivers abound in fish, the forest in game, there are safe and easy landings at 20 places, and in short 1,000 resources that are wanting in the Strait of Le Maire, and off the terrible rocks of Cape Horn, which are continually visited by storms and tempests. Sometimes the tips of her yards would graze the branches of the beeches that hung over the waves. During the first hours of the passage, till you reach Cape Gregory, the shores are low and sandy. The entire passage lasted scarcely 36 hours, and this moving panorama of the two shores well rewarded the pains the geographer took to admire it under the radiant beams of the southern sun. No inhabitant appeared on the shores of the continent, and only a few Fuegians wandered along the barren rocks of Terra del Fuego. At one moment, the Duncan rounded the peninsula of Brunswick between two magnificent sights. Just here the strait cuts between stupendous masses of granite. The base of the mountains was hidden in the heart of immense forests, while their summits, whitened with eternal snow, were lost in the clouds. Towards the southeast Mount Taru towered 6,500 feet aloft. Night came, preceded by a long twilight, the light melting away insensibly by gentle degrees, while the sky was studded with brilliant stars. In the midst of this partial obscurity, the yacht boldly continued on her course, without casting anchor in the safe bays with which the shores abound. Sometimes the tips of her yards would graze the branches of the beeches that hung over the waves. At others, her propeller would beat the waters of the great rivers, starting geese, ducks, snipe, teal, and all the feathered tribes of the marshes. Soon deserted ruins appeared, and fallen monuments, to which the night lent a grand aspect. These were the mournful remains of an abandoned colony, whose name will be an eternal contradiction to the fertility of the coasts and the rich game of the forests. It was Port Famine, the place that the Spaniard Sarmiento colonized in 1581 with 400 emigrants. Here he founded the city of San Felipe. But the extreme severity of the cold weakened the colony. Famine devoured those whom the winter had spared, and in 1587, the explorer Cavendish found the last of these 400 unfortunates dying of hunger amid the ruins of a city only 6 years in existence. Cheerless memories. The vessel coasted along these deserted shores. At daybreak she sailed in the midst of the narrow passes, between beeches, ash trees, and birches, from the bosom of which emerged ivy-clad domes, cupolas tapestried with the hardy holly, and lofty spires, among which the obelisk of Buckland rose to a great height. Far out in the sea sported droves of seals and whales of great size, judging by their spouting, which could be seen at a distance of 4 miles. At last they doubled Cape Froward, still bristling with the ices of winter. On the other side of the strait, on Terra del Fuego, rose Mount Sarmiento to the height of 6,000 feet, an enormous mass of rock broken by bands of clouds, which formed as it were an aerial archipelago in the sky. Port Famine. Cape Froward is the real end of the American continent, for Cape Horn is only a lone rock in the sea. Passing this point, the strait narrowed between Brunswick Peninsula and Desolation Island. Then to fertile shores succeeded a line of wild barren coast, cut by 1,000 inlets of this tortuous labyrinth. The Duncan unerringly and unhesitatingly pursued its capricious windings, mingling her columns of smoke with the mists on the rocks. Without lessening her speed, she passed several Spanish factories established on these deserted shores. At Cape Tamar the strait widened. The yacht rounded the Narborough Islands and approached the southern shores. At last, 36 hours after entering the strait, the rocks of Cape Pillars were discerned at the extreme point of Desolation Island. An immense open glittering sea extended before her prow, and Jacques Paganel, hailing it with an enthusiastic gesture, felt moved like Ferdinand Magellan himself, when the sails of the Trinidad swelled before the breezes of the Pacific. Chapter 10. The course decided. 8 days after doubling Cape Pillars, the Duncan entered at full speed the Bay of Talcahuano, a magnificent estuary, 12 miles long and 9 broad. The weather was beautiful. Not a cloud is seen in the sky of this country from November to March, and the wind from the south blows continually along these coasts, which are protected by the chain of the Andes. Captain Mangles, according to Lord Glenarvan's orders, had kept close to the shore of the continent, examining the numerous wrecks that lined it. A waif, a broken spar, a piece of wood fashioned by the hand of man, might guide the Duncan to the scene of the shipwreck. But nothing was seen, and the yacht continued her course and anchored in the harbor of Talcahuano 42 days after her departure from the waters of the Clyde. Learning Spanish. Glenarvan at once lowered the boat, and, followed by Paganel, landed at the foot of the palisade. The learned geographer, profiting by the circumstance, would have made use of the language which he had studied so conscientiously, but to his great astonishment, he could not make himself understood by the natives. "The accent is what I need," said he. "Let us go to the custom house," replied Glenarvan. There they were informed by means of several English words, accompanied by expressive gestures, that the British consul resided at Conception. It was only an hour's journey. Glenarvan easily found 2 good horses, and a short time after, Paganel and he entered the walls of this great city, which was built by the enterprising genius of Valdivia, the valiant companion of Pizarro. How greatly it had declined from its ancient splendor! Often pillaged by the natives, burnt in 1819, desolate, ruined, its walls still blackened with the flames of devastation, eclipsed by Talcahuano, it now scarcely numbered 8,000 souls. Under the feet of its idle inhabitants, the streets had grown into prairies. There was no commerce, no activity, no business. The mandolin resounded from every balcony, languishing songs issued from the lattices of the windows, and Conception, the ancient city of men, had become a village of women and children. Glenarvan appeared little desirous of seeking the causes of this decline, though Jacques Paganel attacked him on this subject, and without losing an instant, betook himself to the house of J.R. Bentock, Esquire, consul of Her Britannic Majesty. This individual received him very courteously, and when he learned the story of Captain Grant, undertook to search along the entire coast. The question whether the Britannia had been wrecked on the shores of Chile or Araucania was decided in the negative. No report of such an event had come either to the consul or his colleagues in other parts of the country. But Glenarvan was not discouraged. He returned to Talcahuano, and sparing neither fatigue, trouble, or money, he sent men to the coast, but their search was in vain. The most minute inquiries among the people of the vicinity were of no avail. They were forced to conclude that the Britannia had left no trace of her shipwreck. In conception. Try again. Glenarvan then informed his companions of the failure of his endeavors. Mary Grant and her brother could not restrain their grief. It was now 6 days since the arrival of the Duncan at Talcahuano. The passengers were together in the cabin. Lady Helena was consoling, not by her words, for what could she say, but by her caresses, the 2 children of the captain. Jacques Paganel had taken up the document again, and was regarding it with earnest attention, as if he would have drawn from it new secrets. For an hour he had examined it thus, when Glenarvan, addressing him, said, "Paganel, I appeal to your sagacity. Is the interpretation we have made of this document incorrect? Is the sense of these words illogical?" Paganel did not answer. He was reflecting. "Are we mistaken as to the supposed scene of the shipwreck?" continued Glenarvan. "Does not the name Patagonia suggest itself at once to the mind?" Paganel was still silent. "In short," said Glenarvan, "does not the word Indian justify us still more?" "Perfectly," replied MacNab. "And therefore, is it not evident that these shipwrecked men, when they wrote these lines, expected to be prisoners of the Indians?" "There you are wrong, my dear lord," said Paganel at last, "and if your other conclusions are just, the last at least does not seem to me rational." "What do you mean?" asked Lady Helena, while all eyes were turned towards the geographer. "I mean," answered Paganel, emphasizing his words, "that Captain Grant is now prisoner of the Indians, and I will add that the document leaves no doubt on this point." "Explain yourself, sir," said Miss Grant. "Nothing is easier, my dear Mary. Instead of reading they will be prisoners, read they are prisoners, and all will be clear." "But that is impossible," replied Glenarvan. "Impossible, and why, my noble friend?" asked Paganel, smiling. "Because the bottle must have been thrown when the vessel was breaking on the rocks. Hence the degrees of longitude and latitude apply to the very place of shipwreck." "Nothing proves it," said Paganel, earnestly. "And I do not see why the shipwrecked sailors, after being carried by the Indians into the interior of the country, could not have sought to make known by means of this bottle the place of their captivity." "Simply, my dear Paganel, because to throw a bottle into the sea it is necessary, at least, that the sea should be before you." "Or in the absence of the sea," added Paganel, "the rivers which flow into it." An astonished silence followed this unexpected, yet reasonable, answer. By the flash that brightened the eyes of his hearers, Paganel knew that each of them had conceived a new hope. Lady Helena was the first to resume the conversation. "What an idea!" she exclaimed. "What a good idea," added the geographer simply. "Your advice, then?" asked Glenarvan. "My advice is to find the 37th parallel, just where it meets the American coast, and follow it, without deviating half a degree, to the point where it strikes the Atlantic. Perhaps we shall find on its course the survivors of the Britannia." "A feeble chance," replied the major. "However feeble it may be," continued Paganel, "we ought not to neglect it. If I am right that this bottle reached the sea by following the current of a river, we cannot fail to come upon the traces of the prisoners. Look, my friends, look at the map of this country, and I will convince you beyond a doubt." Nil disparandum. So saying, Paganel spread out before them upon the table a large map of Chile and the Argentine provinces. "Look," said he, "and follow me in this passage across the American continent. Let us pass over the narrow strip of Chile and the Cordilleras of the Andes, and descend into the midst of the Pampas. Are rivers, streams, watercourses wanting in these regions? No. Here are the Rio Negro, the Rio Colorado, and their affluents, cut by the 37th parallel, all of which might have served to transport the document. There, perhaps, in the midst of a tribe, in the hands of settled Indians, on the shores of these unknown rivers, in the gorges of the Sierras, those whom I have the right to call our friends are awaiting an interposition of Providence. Ought we, then, to disappoint their hopes? Do you not think we should follow across these countries an unswerving course? And if, contrary to all expectation, I am still mistaken, is it not our duty to trace this parallel to the very end, and if necessary, make upon it the tour of the world? These words, spoken with a noble enthusiasm, excited a deep emotion among Paganel's hearers. All rose to shake hands with him. "Yes, my father is there," cried Robert Grant, devouring the map with his eyes. "And wherever he is," replied Glenarvan, "we shall find him, my child. Nothing is more consistent than our friend Paganel's interpretation, and we must follow without hesitation the course he has indicated. Either Captain Grant is in the hands of countless Indians, or is prisoner in a feeble tribe. In the latter case, we will rescue him. In the former, after ascertaining his situation, we will join the Duncan on the eastern coast, sail to Buenos Aires, and with a detachment, organized by the Major, can overcome all the Indians of the Argentine plains." "Yes, yes, your lordship," answered Captain Mangles, "and I will add that this passage of the continent will be without peril." "Without peril or fatigue," continued Paganel. "How many have already accomplished it who had scarcely our means for success, and whose courage was not sustained by the grandeur of the undertaking?" Sir," exclaimed Mary Grant, in a voice broken with emotion, "how can I thank a devotion that exposes you to so many dangers?" "Dangers," cried Paganel, who uttered the word danger. "Not I," replied Robert Grant, with flashing eye and determined look. "Danger," repeated Paganel, "does such a thing exist? Moreover, what is the question? A journey of scarcely 350 leagues, since we shall proceed in a straight line. A journey which will be accomplished in a favorable latitude and climate. In short, a journey whose duration will be only a month at most. It is a mere walk." "Monsieur Paganel," asked Lady Helena at last, "do you think that, if the shipwrecked sailors have fallen into the power of the Indians, their lives have been spared?" "Certainly I do, madam. The Indians are not cannibals. Far from that. One of my countrymen whom I knew in the society was 3 years prisoner among the Indians of the Pampas. He suffered, was ill-treated, but at last gained the victory in this trying ordeal. A European is a useful person in these countries. The Indians know his value and esteem him very highly." "Well then, there is no more hesitation," said Glenarvan. "We must start, and that too without delay. What course shall we take?" "An easy and agreeable one," replied Paganel. "A few mountains to begin with, then a gentle descent on the eastern slope of the Andes, and at last a level, grassy, sandy plain, a real garden." "Let us see the map," said the Major. "Here it is, my dear MacNab. We shall begin at the end of the 37th parallel on the coast of Chile. After passing through the capital of Araucania, we shall strike the Cordilleras, and descending their steep declivities across the Rio Colorado, we shall reach the Pampas. Passing the frontiers of Buenos Aires, we shall continue our search until we reach the shores of the Atlantic. A stroll across the country." Thus speaking and developing the program of the expedition, Paganel did not even take the trouble to look at the map spread before him. And he had no need to, educated in the schools of Frezier, Molina, Humboldt, and Mears, his unerring memory could neither be deceived nor baffled. After finishing his plan, he added, "Therefore, my dear friends, the course is straight. In 30 days we shall accomplish it, and arrive before the Duncan on the eastern shore, since the westerly winds will delay her progress." "The Duncan, then," said Captain Mangles, "will cross the 37th parallel between Cape Corrientes and Cape St. Antonio." "Exactly." "And whom would you constitute the members of such an expedition?" asked Glenarvan. "The fewer the better. The only point is to ascertain the situation of Captain Grant, and not to engage in combat with the Indians. I think that Lord Glenarvan, as our chief, the Major, who would yield his place to no one, your servant Jack Paganel." "And I," cried Robert Grant. "Robert," said Mary. "And why not?" answered Paganel. "Travels develop youth, we 4 then, and 3 sailors of the Duncan." "What?" exclaimed Captain Mangles. "Your lordship does not intercede for me." "My dear fellow," replied Glenarvan, "we shall leave the ladies on board, the dearest objects we have in the world. Who would watch over them, if not the devoted captain of the Duncan?" "We cannot accompany you then," said Lady Helena, whose eyes were dimmed by a mist of sadness. "My dear wife," replied Glenarvan, "our journey will be performed with unusual rapidity, our separation will be short, and—" The mate, Tom Austin, Wilson, a powerful fellow, and Mulready were the fortunate ones. "Good afternoon." "Yes, yes, I understand you," answered Lady Helena. "Go then, and may you succeed in your enterprise." "Besides, this is not a journey," added Paganel. "What is it then?" asked Lady Helena. "A passage, nothing more. We shall pass, that is all, like honest men, over the country and do all the good possible. Transfer benefaciendo is our motto." With these words the discussion ended. The preparations were begun that very day, and it was resolved to keep the expedition secret, in order not to alarm the Indians. The 14th of October was fixed for the day of departure. When they came to choose the sailors who were to go, they all offered their services, and Glenarvan was forced to make a choice. He preferred to have them draw lots, that he might not mortify such brave men. This was accordingly done, and the mate, Tom Austin, Wilson, a powerful fellow, and Mulready were the fortunate ones. Lord Glenarvan had displayed great energy in his preparations, for he wished to be ready at the day appointed, and he was. Captain Mangles likewise supplied his ship with coal, that he might put to sea at any moment. He wished to gain the Argentine shore before the travelers. Hence there was a real rivalry between Glenarvan and the captain, which was of advantage to both. At last, on the 14th of October, at the time agreed upon, everyone was ready. At the moment of departure the passengers of the yacht assembled in the cabin. The Duncan was on the point of starting, and already her propeller was agitating the quiet waters of Talcahuano Bay. Glenarvan, Paganel, MacNab, Robert Grant, Tom Austin, Wilson, and Mulready, armed with carbines and Colt's revolvers, were preparing to leave the vessel. Guides and mules were waiting for them on shore. "It is time," said Lord Glenarvan at last. "Go then, my husband," replied Lady Helena, restraining her emotion. He pressed her to his breast, while Robert threw himself upon the neck of his sister. "And now, dear companions," said Jacques Paganel, "one last clasp of the hand to last us till we reach the shores of the Atlantic." It was not asking much, but these were clasps which would strengthen the hopes of the worthy geographer. They then returned to the deck, and the 7 travelers left the vessel. They soon reached the wharf, which the yacht approached within less than half a cable's length. Lady Helena cried for the last time, "My friends, God help you." "And he will help us, madam," answered Jacques Paganel, "for I assure you we shall help ourselves." "Forward!" shouted Captain Mangles to his engineer. "En route!" returned Glenarvan, and at the same instant that the travelers, giving reins to their animals, followed the road along the shore, the Duncan started again at full speed on the highway of the ocean. Chapter 11. Traveling in Chile. The native troop engaged by Glenarvan consisted of 3 men and a boy. The leader of the muleteers was an Englishman who had lived in the country for 20 years. His occupation was to let mules to travelers and guide them across the passes of the Andes. Then he consigned them to the care of a Laquino, Argentine guide, who was familiar with the road over the pampas. The procession formed. This Englishman had not so forgotten his native tongue, in the company of mules and Indians, that he could not converse with the travelers. Hence it was easy for Glenarvan to make known his wishes, and for the muleteer to execute his orders, of which circumstance the former availed himself, since Paganel had not yet succeeded in making himself understood. This leader, or catapaz, in the language of Chile, was assisted by 2 native peons and a boy of 12. The peons had charge of the mules laden with the baggage of the party, and the boy led the madrina little mare, which wore small bells, and went in advance of the other 10 mules. The travelers were mounted on 7, and the catapaz on 1, of these animals, while the 2 others carried the provisions and a few rolls of cloth designed to ensure the goodwill of the chiefs of the plains. The peons traveled on foot according to their custom. This journey in South America was, therefore, to be performed under the most favorable conditions of safety and speed. Crossing the Andes is not an ordinary journey. It cannot be undertaken without employing those hardy mules, of which the most preferable belong to the Argentine Republic. These excellent animals have attained in that country a development superior to their pristine quality and strength. They are not very particular about their food, drink only once a day, and easily make 10 leagues in 8 hours. There are no taverns on this route from one ocean to the other. You eat dried meat, rice seasoned with allspice, and whatever game can be captured on the way. In the mountains the torrents, and in the plains the rivers, furnish water, generally flavored with a few drops of rum, of which each has a supply in an oxhorn called chiffle. However, care must be taken not to indulge too much in alcoholic drinks, which are specially injurious in a region where the nervous system is peculiarly excited. As for your bedding, it consists merely of the native saddle called recado. This saddle is made of sheepskins tanned on one side and covered with wool on the other, and is supported by broad girths elaborately embroidered. A traveler wrapped in one of these warm coverings can brave with impunity the dampness of the nights, and enjoy the soundest repose. Glenarvan, who knew how to travel and conform to the customs of different countries, had adopted the Chilean costume for himself and his friends. Paganel and Robert, 2 children, a large and a small one, felt no pleasure in introducing their heads into the national poncho, a large blanket with a hole in the center, and their legs into leathern stirrups. They would rather have seen their mules richly caparisoned, with the Arab bit in their mouths, a long bridle of braided leather for a whip, and their heads adorned with metal ornaments and the alforjas, double saddlebags containing the provisions. Land and water. Paganel, always absent-minded, received 3 or 4 kicks from his excellent animal just as he was mounting. Once in the saddle, however, with his inseparable telescope in a sling and his feet confined in the stirrups, he confided himself to the sagacity of his beast, and had no reason to repent. As for young Robert, he showed from the first a remarkable capacity for becoming an excellent horseman. They started. The day was magnificent, the sky was perfectly clear, and the atmosphere sufficiently refreshed by the sea breezes in spite of the heat of the sun. The little party followed at a rapid pace the winding shores of the bay, and made good progress the first day across the reeds of old dried marshes. Little was said. The parting farewells had left a deep impression upon the minds of all. They could still see the smoke of the Duncan as she gradually disappeared on the horizon. All were silent, except Paganel. This studious geographer kept asking himself questions and answering them in his new language. The Castaways was, moreover, quite a taciturn man whose avocation had not made him loquacious. He scarcely spoke to his peons, for they understood their duty very well. Whenever a mule stopped, they urged him with a guttural cry. If this did not suffice, a good pebble thrown with sure aim overcame his obstinacy. If a girth gave way or a bridle was loosened, the peon, taking off his poncho, enveloped the head of the animal, which, when the injury was repaired, resumed its pace. The custom of the muleteers is to set out at 8 o'clock in the morning after breakfast, and travel thus till it is time to rest at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Glenarvan, accordingly, conformed to this custom. Precisely when the signal to halt was given by the Castaways, the travelers arrived at the city of Araco, situated at the southern extremity of the bay, without having left the foam-washed shore of the ocean. They would have had to proceed 20 miles farther to the west to reach the limits of the 37th parallel. But Glenarvan's agents had already traversed that part of the coast without meeting with any signs of shipwreck. A new exploration became, therefore, useless, and it was decided that the city of Araco should be chosen as their point of departure. From this, their course was to be directed towards the east in a rigorously straight line. The little party entered the city and took up their quarters in the open court of a tavern, whose accommodations were still in a rudimentary state. While supper was preparing, Glenarvan, Paganel, and the Castaways took a walk among the thatch-roofed houses. Except a church and the remains of a convent of Franciscans, Araco presented nothing interesting. Glenarvan attempted to make some inquiries, but failed, while Paganel was in despair at not being able to make himself understood by the inhabitants. But since they spoke Araucanian, his Spanish served him as little as Hebrew. Onward and onward still. The next day, the madrina at the head, and the peons in the rear, the little troop resumed the line of the 37th parallel towards the east. They now crossed the fertile territory of Araucania, rich in vineyards and flocks. But gradually solitude ensued. Scarcely from mile to mile was there a hut of rastradors, Indian horse-tamers. Now and then they came upon an abandoned relay station that only served as a shelter to some wanderer on the plains, and by means of a ford, they crossed the Rio Tubal, the mountains visible in the distance. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after a journey of 35 miles, they halted in the open country under a group of giant myrtles. The mules were unharnessed and left to graze at will upon the rich herbage of the prairie. The saddlebags furnished the usual meat and rice, the pillions spread on the ground served as covering, the saddles as pillows, and each one found on these improvised beds a ready repose, while the peons and the Castaways watched in turn. As the weather continued pleasant, all the travelers, not excepting Robert, were still in good health, and since the journey had begun under such favorable auspices, they thought it best to profit by it and push on. The following day they advanced rapidly, crossed without accident Bell Rapids, and at evening encamped on the banks of the Rio Biobio. There were 35 miles more to travel before they were out of Chile. The country had not changed. It was still rich in amaryllis, violets, date trees, and golden-flowered cactuses. A few animals, among others the ocelot, inhabited the thickets. A heron, a solitary owl, thrushes and snipes wary of the talons of the hawk, were the only representatives of the feathered tribe. Of the natives few were seen. Only some guasos, degenerate children of the Indians and Spanish, galloping on horses which they lacerated with the gigantic spurs that adorned their naked feet, and passing like shadows. They met on the way no one who could inform them, and inquiries were therefore utterly impossible. An astonished Castaways. Glenarvan thought that Captain Grant, if prisoner of the Indians, must have been carried by them beyond the Andes. Their search could be successful only in the Pampas. They must be patient, and travel on swiftly and continuously. By means of a ford, they crossed the Rio Tubal, the mountains visible in the distance. They advanced in the same order as before, which Robert with difficulty kept, for his eagerness led him to press forward, to the great annoyance of his animal. Nothing but a command from Glenarvan would keep the young boy at his place in the line. The country now became more uneven, and several hillocks indicated that they were approaching the mountains. Paganel still continued his study of Spanish. "What a language it is," exclaimed he, "so full and sonorous." "But you are making progress, of course," replied Glenarvan. "Certainly, my dear lord. Ah, if there were only no accent, but alas, there is one." In studying this language, Paganel did not, however, neglect his geographical observations. In these, indeed, he was astonishingly clever, and could not have found his superior. When Glenarvan questioned the Castaways about some peculiarity of the country, his learned companion would always anticipate the answer of the guide, who then gazed at him with a look of amazement. That same day, they met a road which crossed the line that they had hitherto pursued. Lord Glenarvan naturally asked its name of their guide, and Paganel as naturally answered. "The road from Yumbel to Los Angelos." Glenarvan looked at the Castaways. "Exactly," replied he. Then, addressing the geographer, he said, "You have traveled in this country." "Certainly," replied Paganel gravely. "On a mule?" "No, in an armchair." The Castaways did not understand, for he shrugged his shoulders and returned to the head of the troop. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they stopped in a shallow gorge, a few miles above the little town of Loja, and that night the travelers encamped at the foot of the first slopes of the Andes. Chapter 12. 11,000 feet aloft. The route through Chile had as yet presented no serious obstacles, but now the dangers that attend a journey across the mountains suddenly increased. The struggle with the natural difficulties was about to begin in earnest. An important question had to be decided before starting. By what pass could they cross the Andes with the least departure from the prescribed course? The Castaways was questioned on this subject. "I know," he replied, "of but two passes that are practicable in this part of the Andes." "Doubtless the pass of Arica," said Paganel, "which was discovered by Valdivia Mendoza." "Exactly." "And that of Valerica, situated to the south of Nevado." "You are right." "Well, my friend, these two passes have only one difficulty. They will carry us to the south or the north, farther than we wish." "Have you another pass to propose?" asked the major. "Yes," replied Paganel, "the pass of Antuco." "Well," said Glenarvan, "but do you know this pass, Castaways?" "Attaining to eminence." "Yes, my lord, I have crossed it, and did not propose it because it is only a cattle track for the Indian herdsmen of the eastern slopes." "Never mind, my friend, continued Glenarvan. Where the herds of the Indians pass, we can also, and since this will keep us in our course, let us start for the pass of Antuco. The signal for departure was immediately given, and they entered the valley of Los Lejos between great masses of crystallized limestone and ascended a very gradual slope. Towards noon, they had to pass around the shores of a small lake, the picturesque reservoir of all the neighboring streams which flowed into it. Above the lake extended vast llanos, lofty plains covered with grass where the herds of the Indians grazed. Then they came upon a swamp which extended to the south and north, but which the instinct of the mules enabled them to avoid. Soon Fort Ballinaire appeared on a rocky peak which it crowned with its dismantled walls. The ascent had already become abrupt and stony, and the pebbles, loosened by the hoofs of the mules, rolled under their feet in a rattling torrent. The road now became difficult and even perilous. The steepness increased, the walls on either side approached each other more and more, while the precipices yawned frightfully. The mules advanced cautiously in single file, with their noses to the ground, scenting the way. Now and then, at a sudden turn, the madrina disappeared, and the little caravan was then guided by the distant tinkling of her bell. Sometimes, too, the capricious windings of the path would bend the column into two parallel lines, and the catapaz could talk to the peons, while a crevasse, scarcely 2 fathoms wide, but 200 deep, formed an impassable abyss between them. Under these conditions, it was difficult to distinguish the course. The almost incessant action of subterranean and volcanic agency changes the road, and the landmarks are never the same. Therefore the catapaz hesitated, stopped, looked about him, examined the form of the rocks, and searched on the crumbling stones for the tracks of Indians. Glenarvan followed in the steps of his guide. He perceived, he felt, his embarrassment, increasing with the difficulties of the way. He did not dare to question him, but thought that it was better to trust to the instinct of the muleteers and mules. For an hour longer the catapaz wandered at a venture, but always seeking the more elevated parts of the mountain. At last he was forced to stop short. They were at the bottom of a narrow valley, one of those ravines that the Indians call quebradas. A perpendicular wall of porphyry barred their exit. Climbing a mountain. The catapaz, after searching vainly for a passage, dismounted, folded his arms and waited. Glenarvan approached him. "Have you lost your way?" he asked. "No, my lord," replied the catapaz. "But we are not at the pass of Antuco." "We are." "Are you not mistaken?" "I am not. Here are the remains of a fire made by the Indians, and the tracks left by their horses." "Well, they passed this way." "Yes, but we cannot. The last earthquake has made it impracticable." "For mules," replied the major, "but not for men." "That is for you to decide," said the catapaz. "I have done what I could. My mules and I are ready to turn back, if you please, and search for the other passes of the Andes." "But that will cause a delay." "Of 3 days at least." Glenarvan listened in silence to the words of the catapaz, who had evidently acted in accordance with his engagement. His mules could go no farther, but when the proposal was made to retrace their steps, Glenarvan turned towards his companions and said, "Do you wish to go on?" "We will follow you," replied Tom Austin. "And even precede you," added Paganel. "What is it, after all, to scale a chain of mountains whose opposite slopes afford an unusually easy descent? This accomplished, we can find the Argentine Laquinos, who will guide us across the pampas, and swift horses accustomed to travel over the plains. Forward, then, without hesitation." "Forward," cried his companions. "You do not accompany us," said Glenarvan to the catapaz. "I am the muleteer," he replied. "As you say." "Never mind," said Paganel. "On the other side of this wall we shall find the pass of Antuco again, and I will lead you to the foot of the mountain as directly as the best guide of the Andes." Glenarvan accordingly settled with the catapaz, and dismissed him, his peons, and his mules. The arms, the instruments, and the remaining provisions were divided among the 7 travelers. By common consent, it was decided that the ascent should be undertaken immediately, and that, if necessary, they should travel part of the night. Around the precipice to the left wound a steep path that mules could not ascend. The difficulties were great, but after 2 hours of fatigue and wandering, Glenarvan and his companions found themselves again in the pass of Antuco. They were now in that part of the Andes properly so called, not far from the main ridge of the mountains. But of the path traced out, of the pass, nothing could be seen. All this region had just been thrown into confusion by the recent earthquakes. They ascended all night, climbed almost inaccessible plateaus, and leaped over broad and deep crevasses. Their arms took the place of ropes, and their shoulders served as steps. The strength of Mulrady and the skill of Wilson were often called into requisition. Many times, without their devotion and courage, the little party could not have advanced. Glenarvan never lost sight of young Robert, whose youth and eagerness led him to acts of rashness, while Paganel pressed on with all the ardor of a Frenchman. As for the Major, he only moved as much as was necessary, no more, no less, and mounted the path by an almost insensible motion. Did he perceive that he had been ascending for several hours? It is not certain. Perhaps he imagined he was descending. Practicing Excelsior. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the travelers had attained a height of 7,500 feet. They were now on the lower ridges, the last limit of arborescent vegetation. At this hour, the aspect of these regions was entirely changed. Great blocks of glittering ice, of a bluish color in certain parts, rose on all sides and reflected the first rays of the sun. The ascent now became very perilous. They no longer advanced without carefully examining the ice. Wilson had taken the lead, and with his foot tested the surface of the glaciers. His companions followed exactly in his footsteps and avoided uttering a word, for the least sound might have caused the fall of the snowy masses suspended 800 feet above their heads. They had reached the region of shrubs, which, 450 feet higher, gave place to grass and cactuses. At 11,000 feet, all traces of vegetation disappeared. The travelers had stopped only once to recruit their strength by a hasty repast, and with superhuman courage, they resumed the ascent in the face of the ever-increasing dangers. 2 hours more of terrible exertion followed. They kept ascending, in order to reach the highest summit of this part of the mountain. Somewhat serious. The strength of the little troop, however, in spite of their courage, was almost gone. Glenarvan, seeing the exhaustion of his companions, regretted having engaged in the undertaking. Young Robert struggled against fatigue, but could go no farther. Glenarvan stopped. "We must take a rest," said he, for he clearly saw that no one else would make this proposal. "Take a rest," replied Paganel. "How, where? We have no shelter." "It is indispensable, if only for Robert." "No, my lord," replied the courageous child. "I can still walk, do not stop." "We will carry you, my boy," said Paganel. "But we must, at all hazards, reach the eastern slope. There, perhaps, we shall find some hut in which we can take refuge. I ask for 2 hours more of travel." "Do you all agree?" asked Glenarvan. "Yes," replied his companions. "I will take charge of the brave boy," added the equally brave Mulrady. They resumed their march towards the east. 2 hours more of terrible exertion followed. They kept ascending, in order to reach the highest summit of this part of the mountain. Whatever were the desires of these courageous men, the moment now came when the most valiant failed, and dizziness, that terrible malady of the mountains, exhausted not only their physical strength but their moral courage. It is impossible to struggle with impunity against fatigues of this kind. Soon falls became frequent, and those who fell could only advance by dragging themselves on their knees. Exhaustion was about to put an end to this too prolonged ascent, and Glenarvan was considering with terror the extent of the snow, the cold which in this fatal region was so much to be dreaded, the shadows that were deepening on the solitary peaks, and the absence of a shelter for the night, when the Major stopped him, and in a calm tone said, "A hut." Chapter 13. A sudden descent. Anyone but MacNab would have passed by, around, or even over this hut 100 times without suspecting its existence. A projection on the surface of the snow scarcely distinguished it from the surrounding rocks. It was necessary to uncover it. After half an hour of persistent labor, Wilson and Mulrady had cleared away the entrance to the casucha, and the little party stepped in. A restaurant reopened. This casucha, constructed by the Indians, was made of adobes, a kind of bricks dried in the sun. 10 persons could easily find room inside, and if its walls had not been sufficiently watertight in the rainy season, at this time at least, they were some protection against the severity of the cold. There was, besides, a sort of fireplace with a flue of bricks very poorly laid, which enabled them to kindle a fire, and thus withstand the external temperature. "Here is a shelter, at least," said Glenarvan, "even if it is not comfortable. Providence has led us hither, and we cannot do better than accept this fortune." "Why," replied Paganel, "it is a palace. It only wants sentries and courtiers. We shall get along admirably here." "Especially when a good fire is blazing on the hearth," said Tom Austin. "For, if we are hungry, we are none the less cold, it seems to me, and for my part, a good faggot would delight me more than a slice of venison." "Well, Tom," said Paganel, "we will try to find something combustible." "Something combustible on the top of the Andes," said Mulrady, shaking his head doubtfully. "Since a chimney has been made in this hut," replied the Major, "there is probably something here to burn." "Our friend is right," added Glenarvan. "Prepare everything for supper, and I will play the part of woodcutter." "I will accompany you with Wilson," said Paganel. "If you need me," said Robert, rising. "No, rest yourself, my brave boy," replied Glenarvan. "You will be a man when others are only children." Glenarvan, Paganel, and Wilson went out of the hut. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. The cold was keen and cutting, in spite of the calmness of the air. The azure of the sky was already fading, and the sun shedding his last rays on the lofty peaks of the mountains.